This is a lesson where I'm going to be introducing you to HTML. So basically, HTML is the backbone of what is presented on the internet. So we get files that we call either HTML or HTML. So it doesn't actually matter because the browsers will render out either one of these file types, and they understand that these are web files and they're meant to be rendered out within the browser. So what happens is when you create an HTML file, then your browser comes to that web page and it actually renders out all of that content within the web page. So we can see here that any web page, it's a combination of all of these opening and closing tags, and there's just a whole bunch of information. So when we look at the source code for this website, we see that there's actually some distinct areas within our web page. So all of them start out with HTML. We've got some content here within the head area. We've got a body area, and then we've got some script information here. So this is JavaScript. We also have some styling up here. So this is CSS. And then in between here we've got body, and we've got a whole bunch of these opening and closing tags. So P opening, P closing, and this is what HTML is. So it actually represents a blueprint for how you want the page rendered out by the browser. And then we see down here that we've got a body closing and an HTML closing. And all of the web pages are going to be within that same format because this is the HTML structure that is used in order to design web pages. So let's go ahead and open up our editor and create some web content. So we saw that all of these HTML pages, they had a series of opening and closing tags. So we're going to do the same thing where we're actually going to set up an HTML. I'm going to give you an example of some HTML, and then we're going to go ahead and set up an actual HTML template that we can go ahead and reuse over and over again as we create different websites out of that basic structure. So typically you're going to see an HTML page where we've got an opening and closing tag. So these are tags. This is the paragraph tag, so it's just indicated by a P within the brackets here, and whatever content is in between the P's, this is where the paragraph is. So P stands for paragraph, and we see that once we create this paragraph, and I'm going to render that out over here in the display area, we see we've got content is a paragraph. So it doesn't really look like the HTML tags are doing a whole lot right now, but if I add a whole bunch of them, we're going to see that when I render this out, that there's actually some structure that's by default within the HTML. So this is going to be different than if I was to do something like this and save that, and we see that automatically brackets tries to beautify that text, and it outputs it within this kind of format where there's no additional formatting provided within the HTML. It gets rid of all that excess white space, and all it does is just line up all of that content. So we see that what HTML is doing is it's allowing us to structure our content that's being presented within the browser. So we see over here the paragraphs are actually structuring them as separate container areas, separate paragraphs, and they're actually dividing up these pieces of content, and it's presenting it in a different way. And this is essentially what each one of these tags has. It's got its default properties that help the browser understand how this content is meant to be rendered out. And with HTML, it's a series of complex divisions and breakups of pieces of content and structuring in a way that you want to present it. And also, this is the point where we also start thinking about styling and the different styling that we want to add in within our web page, because this is how we want to present our content. So anything that's within one container area is going to be content that gets rendered out within that container area. And then that container itself will have some styling attached to it. So we see here that I've got a number of different ways that I'm representing this content, and we see that I've got a bunch of white space in here. So one important thing to remember about how the HTML file handles and displays the content is going to be different how it's output within the web page, because you need to use HTML structure in order to tell the browser how you want your web page to look. So even though I've changed the way it is being displayed here, it's actually, when I refresh it, it's actually the same thing. So even if I was to add in a bunch of spacing here and I was to make a real mess of the content that I'm displaying here, it actually doesn't matter, because whenever I save the file, when I render it out, the content is actually going to be limited to having one space. So even though I've got a bunch of spacing here, I'm limited to only having one space being displayed out. So this is the difference between the way that you present your HTML file and the way it gets rendered out. And typically when we are writing HTML, then we do want to beautify the content because we want it to make it nice and readable. So this is just removing out all that excess white space and making it more readable for you when you're coming in and creating that HTML file. So this is just the basics of HTML, and we do have a series of opening and closing tags. We also have what are known as self-closing tags. So we've got something like a line break, which actually doesn't have any content in between it, but it's actually for formatting within our HTML structure. So we see that the line break, typically it wouldn't have any content in it, and it's serving the purpose of creating that line break, which is different than a paragraph because there's no additional formatting, and this is just something, another piece of content. When the browser's rendering it out, it hits that line break and it says, okay, well, this is a new line, starts a new line, and continues along within that paragraph element. And when we are referring to elements, so these are tags, so the paragraph opening and closing tags, and its entirety with the opening and closing tag and the content within it, this makes it an element. So this is the difference between tags and elements, and when we're referring to our HTML code, this is how we typically would refer to that as to elements and tags. So in the next lesson, let's start building out our basic default HTML template and start creating some web pages using HTML.